In the arid, sun-scorched valleys of the Hadramaut region of Yemen, the roots of a modern global upheaval were quietly sown. It was here that Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, a desperately poor, uneducated laborer, decided to seek his fortune beyond the jagged mountains of his homeland. Journeying to the burgeoning kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the early 1930s, Mohammed possessed little more than a formidable work ethic and a shrewd mind for business. He began as a bricklayer, laboring in the brutal heat, but quickly established himself as a contractor capable of executing complex projects. Through a combination of relentless ambition and strategic deference to the Saudi royal family, he secured exclusive contracts to renovate the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. This monumental undertaking transformed the bin Laden Group into a multi-billion-dollar empire, deeply intertwined with the House of Saud. The family was catapulted into the highest echelons of Saudi aristocracy, amassing staggering wealth and unparalleled prestige. Yet, amidst this newfound opulence, the strict, austere religious values of their origins remained fiercely guarded. Into this sprawling, wealthy, and devoutly conservative dynasty, Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden was born in Riyadh in 1957. He was the 17th of Muhammad's 52 children, born to Alia Ghanem, a Syrian woman who was one of his father's many wives. In a family of such vast proportions, the pursuit of paternal attention was fiercely competitive, though Osama's early years were characterized by a quiet, observant demeanor rather than outward assertiveness. His mother, often marginalized within the complex hierarchy of the patriarchal household, eventually divorced Muhammad, and Osama was largely raised in the coastal city of Jeddah by his mother and her new husband. The young Osama grew up in a world of stark contradictions, surrounded by unimaginable Western-style luxury and private tutors, yet steeped in the rigid, fundamentalist interpretations of Wahhabi Islam. The defining tragedy of his youth occurred in 1967, when his father, the towering patriarch of the bin Laden empire, perished in a plane crash. Osama, barely 10 years old, inherited a multi-million-dollar fortune, but lost the central authority figure of his life, leaving a profound void that he would soon seek to fill with fervent religious ideology. The intellectual and spiritual transformation of the young heir began in earnest during his adolescence at the Al-Thaghair Model School in Jeddah. While the institution catered to the sons of the Saudi elite and offered a secular, Western-influenced curriculum, it also served as an incubator for an entirely different philosophy. It was here, within an after-school Islamic study group, that Osama was first introduced to the deeply politicized theology of the Muslim Brotherhood. Charismatic, politically exiled teachers from Syria and Egypt captivated the quiet teenager with their visions of a pure Islamic state, free from the corrupting influence of Western secularism. They taught that the Islamic world had fallen into a state of ignorance and moral decay, a modern-day Jahiliyyah, and that a strict, uncompromising return to the fundamental tenets of the faith was the only path to salvation. Osama, previously known for his polite and unassuming nature, began to adopt a profound, almost rigid piety. He stopped watching television, refused to wear Western clothing, and devoted himself entirely to the rigorous study of Scripture, quietly cementing the ideological foundation that would dictate the remainder of his life. This ideological fervor intensified when Osama enrolled at King Abdul Aziz University in Jeddah in the late 1970s. Ostensibly studying economics and business administration to prepare for a role within the family conglomerate, his true academic passion lay in Islamic studies. The campus cane was a hotbed of political and religious discourse, heavily influenced by academics who had fled persecution in other Arab nations. Chief among them was Abdullah Azzam, a charismatic Palestinian cleric and leading figure in the Muslim Brotherhood. Azzam's fiery rhetoric, which framed the defense of Muslim lands as a mandatory individual duty for every able-bodied believer, struck a deep, resonant chord within the young bin Laden. Azzam envisioned a transnational, pan-Islamic brotherhood, united by armed struggle, a concept that completely captivated Osama's imagination. As his formal business studies fell by the wayside, Osama spent countless hours absorbing Azzam's radical interpretations of jihad. He was no longer merely a wealthy Saudi scion. He was rapidly evolving into a devoted ideologue, searching for a tangible cause to which he could dedicate his inherited wealth and his increasingly radicalized worldview. The year 1979 proved to be the cataclysmic catalyst that irrevocably altered the trajectory of Osama bin Laden's life and the shape of the modern world. In rapid succession, a series of geopolitical earthquakes shattered the status quo of the Middle East. The Iranian Revolution demonstrated that a popular Islamic uprising could successfully overthrow a deeply entrenched, Western-backed monarch. Shortly thereafter, the shocking seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by apocalyptic extremists deeply rattled the Saudi establishment, exposing the vulnerabilities of the very system that protected the bin Laden family's wealth. But it was the final event of that turbulent year, the Soviet Union's brutal military invasion of Afghanistan, that provided Osama with his ultimate, defining purpose. The invasion was universally condemned throughout the Islamic world as an aggressive, godless assault on a sovereign Muslim nation. For the young, restless millionaire, deeply indoctrinated by the teachings of Abdullah Azzam, the Soviet invasion was not merely a distant geopolitical conflict. It was a divine summons, a clear, unequivocal call to holy war that he could not and would not ignore. Compelled by this perceived religious duty, Osama traveled to the Pakistani border city of Peshawar, the chaotic, dusty staging ground for the Afghan resistance. Initially, he did not travel as a frontline combatant, but rather as a highly privileged benefactor. Utilizing his vast personal fortune and his extensive connections within the Saudi elite, bin Laden began funneling immense sums of money, specialized construction equipment, and crucial supplies to the various factions of the Afghan Mujahideen. He moved seamlessly between the air-conditioned palaces of the Gulf and the rugged refugee camps of the frontier, serving as a critical financial conduit for the resistance. His efforts were tacitly encouraged by the Saudi government and aligned, albeit indirectly, with the covert objectives of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, both of which were intent on bleeding the Soviet military. In these early days, Osama was viewed not as a global threat, but as a pious, generous philanthropist, a wealthy aristocrat who had selflessly forsaken a life of unimaginable luxury to support his beleaguered brethren in their desperate struggle against a communist superpower. Recognizing the need for a more organized approach to manage the influx of foreign volunteers pouring into Peshawar, bin Laden reunited with his former mentor, Abdullah Azzam. Together, in 1984, they established the Maktab al-Khidmat, or the Afghan Services Bureau. This organization functioned as a highly efficient logistical clearinghouse for the global jihad. It funded the travel, provided the housing, and facilitated the military training of thousands of eager young Arab men who had traveled to Pakistan to fight. Bin Laden paid for guest houses, training camps, and even the printing of recruitment magazines that were distributed globally, glorifying the Afghan resistance and beckoning a new generation to the battlefield. The Maktab al-Khidmat was a masterpiece of organizational logistics, heavily subsidized by Osama's personal wealth. Through this bureau, bin Laden began to forge a vast, interconnected network of radicalized individuals from across the globe. He was no longer just a financier. He was building a transnational army, cultivating intense personal loyalties among a diverse cadre of fighters who would eventually form the core of his future endeavors. Despite his indispensable role as a logistical mastermind and financier, Osama bin Laden yearned for the spiritual validation of physical combat. He sought to transform his image from that of a wealthy patron to that of a battle-tested warrior. Leveraging his family's construction expertise, he brought heavy bulldozers and engineering equipment directly to the mountainous front lines, personally overseeing the excavation of massive, fortified cave complexes designed to shelter the Mujahideen. His defining martial moment arrived in 1987 during the Battle of Jaji. Establishing his own independent base manned exclusively by Arab volunteers, bin Laden's forces engaged in a fierce, multi-day confrontation with Soviet commandos. Though the military significance of the battle was minimal, its propaganda value was incalculable. Osama himself was lightly wounded, an event he deftly exploited to craft a powerful, enduring mythos. He returned from Jaji heralded as a fearless commander who had stared down a superpower. This heavily embellished narrative of personal bravery cemented his absolute authority among the Arab volunteers, silencing any lingering doubts about his commitment to the physical realities of holy war. As the decade drew to a close, ideological fissures began to fracture the leadership of the Arab resistance. Abdullah Azzam maintained that the foreign fighters should integrate completely with the native Afghan forces and continue the fight until the communist government in Kabul was entirely dismantled. Bin Laden, however, heavily influenced by the radical exclusionary ideology of the Egyptian militant Ayman al-Zawahiri, envisioned an entirely different, far more ambitious path. He proposed the creation of a distinct, permanent vanguard, an elite multinational force capable of projecting terror and waging jihad anywhere in the world, completely independent of the Afghan conflict. In late 1988, this vision materialized with the clandestine founding of al-Qaeda, meaning the base or the foundation. The formal schism between mentor and student was stark, and tensions in Peshawar ran dangerously high. In November 1989, Abdullah Azzam was assassinated in a still unsolved car bombing. His death removed the final ideological restraint on bin Laden, leaving the wealthy Saudi heir with undisputed control over a highly trained, deeply radicalized global militant network. With the Soviet Union utterly defeated and withdrawing its battered forces in 1989, Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia. He was welcomed not merely as a scion of a prominent family, but as a conquering hero, widely celebrated in the Saudi press for his perceived role in toppling a superpower. He settled back into a comfortable life, managing branches of the family business while delivering passionate sermons in local mosques, warning of new threats to the Islamic world. The geopolitical landscape, however, shattered once again in August 1990 when Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded and occupied neighboring Kuwait, placing Iraqi armored divisions perilously close to the Saudi border. Recognizing a profound existential threat to his homeland, bin Laden approached the Saudi royal family with an audacious proposal. He offered to mobilize his battle-hardened network of al-Qaeda veterans to defend the kingdom, arguing that a holy war against the secular Iraqi Baathists was the only righteous path. His offer was swiftly and perhaps condescendingly dismissed by the Saudi defense minister, setting the stage for a catastrophic ideological collision. The Saudi monarchy, severely doubting the military efficacy of bin Laden's irregular militias against a mechanized modern army, instead invited a massive coalition of Western forces, led unequivocally by the United States, to deploy onto Saudi soil. For Osama bin Laden, the arrival of hundreds of thousands of non-Muslim American troops in the land encompassing the two holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina, was an agonizing, unforgivable desecration. His previous loyalty to the House of Saud instantly evaporated, replaced by a ferocious, consuming outrage. He began to publicly and vehemently criticize the royal family, accusing them of apostasy and of betraying the fundamental tenets of the faith by relying on infidels for protection. The Saudi regime, initially tolerant of their former hero, quickly lost patience with his subversive rhetoric. In 1991, viewing him as a severe domestic security threat, the government restricted his movements, froze his bank accounts, and placed him under de facto house arrest, effectively transforming the celebrated son of the kingdom into a despised and dangerous political dissident. Realizing that his continued presence in Saudi Arabia would lead to his inevitable imprisonment, bin Laden utilized his remaining connections to flee the kingdom in 1991, eventually seeking refuge in the Republic of Sudan the following year. Sudan, governed by an ambitious Islamist regime eager to attract foreign capital and radical thinkers, offered him a seemingly perfect sanctuary. In Khartoum, bin Laden resurrected his dual persona, part legitimate businessman, part militant orchestrator. He invested heavily in the impoverished nation's infrastructure, building major highways, agricultural projects, and a modernized airport, simultaneously establishing a complex web of legitimate corporate fronts. Beneath this veneer of civilian enterprise, however, the architecture of global terror was rapidly expanding. Al-Qaeda established new, highly secretive training camps on Sudanese soil, forging tactical alliances with various extremist organizations ranging from Egyptian jihadists to Iranian intelligence operatives. The quiet years in Sudan were not a period of retirement, but a crucial phase of logistical consolidation, transforming al-Qaeda from a regional militia into an organized, heavily funded transnational syndicate. The sanctuary in Sudan provided the necessary operational space for al-Qaeda to begin projecting violence on a global scale. Bin Laden's militant network was increasingly implicated in a series of sophisticated, devastating attacks aimed at destabilizing American influence and punishing the Saudi regime. Though his direct operational control was often deliberately ambiguous, the ideological and financial fingerprints of al-Qaeda were unmistakable in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York and the brutal ambush of American forces in Mogadishu, Somalia. In 1995, a deadly car bomb decimated a Saudi National Guard training center in Riyadh, followed the next year by the catastrophic bombing of the Khobar Towers, which housed American military personnel in Saudi Arabia. The sheer audacity and lethality of these strikes forced the international community to recognize the severe threat he posed. In 1994, the Saudi government formally stripped him of his citizenship, and his own family, desperate to protect their vast commercial empire, publicly disowned him, severing the financial lifelines that had initially fueled his ascent. Under immense mounting pressure from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, the Sudanese government finally capitulated. In the spring of 1996, Osama bin Laden was formally expelled from Khartoum. Stripped of his citizenship, disowned by his family, and hunted by international intelligence agencies, his options were severely limited. He chartered a private jet and returned to the rugged, familiar terrain of Afghanistan, arriving in the eastern mountains near Jalalabad. Afghanistan was now fractured by a brutal civil war, but a rising ultra-conservative faction known as the Taliban was rapidly seizing control of the country. Bin Laden quickly forged a symbiotic alliance with the Taliban's reclusive leader, Mullah Omar, securing a heavily fortified safe haven in exchange for massive financial and military support. Safely entrenched in the Hindu Kush Mountains, an emboldened bin Laden took a monumental, terrifying step. In August 1996, he issued a sweeping 30-page religious decree, a fatwa, formally and unequivocally declaring a global holy war against the United States of America and its allies. The declaration of war was not mere rhetoric. It was the prologue to unprecedented bloodshed. In February 1998, bin Laden expanded the scope of his violent mandate, co-signing a second, far more aggressive fatwa with Ayman al-Zawahiri, officially merging al-Qaeda with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. This document declared that killing Americans and their allies, both military and civilian, was the individual duty of every Muslim globally, regardless of where they were found. Exactly 6 months later, this terrifying doctrine was manifested in synchronized catastrophic violence. On the morning of August 7, 1998, massive truck bombs detonated simultaneously outside the United States embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The colossal blasts tore through the densely populated diplomatic zones, murdering over 220 people and wounding thousands more, the vast majority of whom were innocent local civilians. This devastating operational success catapulted Osama bin Laden from a regional agitator to the undisputed most wanted fugitive on the planet, firmly placing al-Qaeda at the very center of American intelligence crosshairs. The United States' response was swift, though ultimately ineffective in neutralizing the core threat. President Bill Clinton authorized Operation Infinite Reach, launching dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles into Afghanistan and Sudan, aiming to obliterate al-Qaeda training camps and suspected chemical weapons facilities. Bin Laden, however, narrowly survived the bombardment in the Afghan mountains, emerging from the dust unscathed and vastly empowered. The failed missile strikes served only to amplify his status as a defiant, invincible figure in the radicalized underground, a man who could withstand the full technological fury of the American military. Unfazed by the retaliation, al-Qaeda's planning continued with chilling precision. In October 2000, a small fiberglass boat packed with military-grade explosives was expertly piloted into the hull of the USS Cole, an American guided missile destroyer refueling in the port of Aden, Yemen. The massive explosion ripped a massive hole in the warship, killing 17 American sailors. The strike was a humiliating blow to the U.S. Navy and a clear, terrifying demonstration of al-Qaeda's expanding maritime capabilities and unbroken resolve. While the world remained focused on the aftermath of the USS Cole, the architectural blueprints for a far more devastating spectacle were already in motion, overseen from the remote caves of Afghanistan. The culmination of bin Laden's apocalyptic vision arrived on the clear, crisp morning of September 11, 2001. 19 highly trained hijackers, systematically radicalized and funded by al-Qaeda, commandeered 4 commercial passenger jets in the skies over the eastern United States. The weaponization of civilian aircraft resulted in an unprecedented, horrific massacre. 2 planes were flown deliberately into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, triggering their catastrophic, televised collapse. A 3rd aircraft was driven into the Pentagon, the absolute nerve center of the American military. The 4th, destined for the U.S. Capitol, crashed into a Pennsylvania field after a desperate passenger revolt. Nearly 3,000 innocent lives were extinguished in mere hours. Osama bin Laden had achieved his ultimate, horrifying objective, orchestrating the most devastating foreign attack on American soil in history and permanently fracturing the geopolitical order of the modern world. The retribution was immediate, overwhelming and absolute. In October 2001, an American-led military coalition invaded Afghanistan, tasked with the complete annihilation of al-Qaeda and the total dismantling of the Taliban regime that had harbored them. Supported by relentless, devastating aerial bombardments, Northern Alliance ground forces rapidly swept across the country, capturing major cities and forcing the militants to retreat into the harsh, unforgiving terrain along the Pakistani border. By December, bin Laden and the remnants of his most loyal guard were heavily besieged in the rugged, heavily fortified cave complex of Tora Bora. As American Special Operations Forces and local proxy fighters closed in, subjecting the mountains to continuous, earth-shattering airstrikes, the al-Qaeda leader's demise seemed utterly imminent. Yet, exploiting a combination of intimate geographical knowledge, deeply rooted tribal loyalties, and highly questionable tactical decisions by the coalition command, bin Laden managed to slip through the porous, frozen border into the lawless tribal regions of Pakistan, vanishing completely into the shadows. For the next decade, the world's most hunted man became an invisible, elusive phantom. A colossal, multi-billion-dollar intelligence dragnet, utilizing the most advanced surveillance technology ever created, scoured the globe, yet bin Laden evaded capture with frustrating persistence. Forced to abandon direct operational control of his sprawling terrorist network, he transitioned into an ideological figurehead, communicating solely through heavily encrypted courier networks and the occasional release of grainy video and audio recordings. These dispatches, secretly recorded in hiding and broadcast via satellite networks, served to continuously taunt his Western pursuers and incite further acts of decentralized lone wolf terrorism. Unbeknownst to the intelligence agencies searching the desolate tribal agencies, bin Laden had eventually moved into a heavily fortified, imposing three-story compound in the military garrison city of Abbottabad, Pakistan. There he lived out his final years in a bizarre state of domestic confinement, surrounded by his remaining wives and children, pacing the courtyard of his concrete fortress while the global jihad he had violently ignited slowly fractured and mutated beyond his control. The decade-long manhunt culminated in the dark, early hours of May 2, 2011. Acting on intelligence meticulously gathered over years of interrogations and the tracking of a trusted courier, two modified American Black Hawk helicopters breached Pakistani airspace under the cover of a moonless night. Operation Neptune Spear was executed with lethal, uncompromising precision. Dozens of elite Navy SEALs descended upon the Abbottabad compound, violently breaching the heavily fortified walls and methodically clearing the structure room by room. On the third floor, they encountered the architect of September 11th. Osama bin Laden was shot and killed, his body swiftly removed, identified, and ultimately buried at sea to prevent the creation of a physical shrine. The death of its founding leader dealt a massive, irreversible psychological blow to al-Qaeda. However, the malignant ideology he had so carefully cultivated over decades of violence did not die with him in that dark room. He left behind a fractured, paranoid world, an enduring blueprint for global militancy, and a dark, indelible legacy that continues to haunt the geopolitical landscape to this day.